So in this video, we're going to do basic concepts of probability and counting. So the first definition is a probability experiment. Probability experiment is an action or trial through which specific results are obtained. One of the things about this, we cannot predict these results with certainty. Okay? So think of a probability experiment like flipping a coin. Okay? Now, an outcome is the result of a single trial in a probability experiment. So in our example of flipping a coin, outcomes, when I flip a coin, I could get a single outcome of heads. Okay, that's an outcome. Another outcome you could get when you flip a coin is a tails. So those are outcomes. A single outcome from a trial probability experiment. Now, the next one is the sample space, sometimes denoted by this script S here. It's the set of all possible outcomes in a probability experiment. Now, my probability experiment of flipping a coin, the set of all possible outcomes, you can either get a heads or you can get a tails. So I'll let H represent heads and T represent tails. That's the sample space for that probability experiment. Now, this last definition here, this is an event. Event is a subset of a sample space, okay? This is one or more outcomes, one or more outcomes. Now, there's a special type of event called a simple event. And this is when there is exactly one outcome. So you might be asked, what are the outcomes for this event? All the outcomes are heads and tails, but is this event a simple event or is it just a regular event? Well, if the event is just, flipping a heads, there's only one way to get a heads, so that's a simple event, okay? So an event is just a subset of the sample space. So you think about like rolling a die, okay? If you roll a die, think about rolling a die. You've got 6 sides to a die. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So say you have the event E, you roll an even number. What are the outcomes for event E? Well, E could be a 2, a 4, and a 6. And that would be a regular event because it has one or more outcomes. There are 3 ways to get an even number. All right? So here's an experiment. So the experiment says roll a die. And anytime it just says roll a die, we assume the die has 6 sides. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Unless they tell you otherwise, assume that it has 6 sides. Now, then you flip a coin. A coin is either heads or tails, okay? Determine the number of outcomes and identify the sample space. So how do we do this? We're going to do this with this example with a tree diagram. So a tree diagram, okay, step 1, we roll a die. So there's 6 outcomes that can happen. We get a 1, we get a 2, we get a 3, we get a 4, we get a 5, and we get a 6. Okay? What is step 2? Flip a coin. When you flip a coin, two things can happen. Either you get a heads or you get a tails. Either you get a heads or a tails. H or T. Now, we need to talk about what each one of these represents. So if I follow this path here where I get a 1 and then a heads, so this would be a 1H, meaning I got a 1 and then I get a heads. If I follow this branch here, what does that mean? That means I got a tails. Got a 3 and then I got a tails. This one is a 1 and a T, a 2H, 2T, 3H, 3T, 4H, 4T, 5H, 5T, 6H, 6T. Now, how many outcomes total are there? If I add up all those, I should get 12 of them. So if I want to identify the sample space is equal to 1H, 2H, 3H, 4H, 5H, and 6H. Okay. But it also has 1T, 2T, 3T, 4T, 5T, and 6T. Okay, that's the sample space. So how many outcomes are there? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So to determine the number of outcomes, there's 12 outcomes. Identify the sample space. There's my sample space right there. Now, you might be asked, okay? So you might be asked this question right here. So let me make this a little bit smaller so I can write out this question. So you could be asked the question, write the event E that you roll an odd number and get heads. Okay? So the event E is that you roll an odd number and then you get a heads. What are odd numbers? Odd numbers are 1, 3, and 5. So what are my events that I could get? I could roll a 1, get a heads. I could roll a 3 and get a heads. And then I could roll a 5 and get a heads. Why don't I consider like 5T for 5 tails? Because it says you roll an odd and you get heads. So the only way I can roll an odd and get heads is here. And get a 3, which is odd, and then a heads here. And then get a 5 and then a heads there. So those are the only 3 that work. So there's 3 outcomes. So this event has 3 outcomes in it.